Hey, what's going on, everyone? And I just got one question for you today. What's an if statement? Okay, this one's all about if statements. Now, there's going to be a little bit more explanation here because there actually can be a lot to if statements. So we're going to try to break it down and make it as digestible as possible. This one's going to be pretty detailed, so I will try to put timestamps in this, and so you can see the timestamps below, and you can go to the spots that you're interested in. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is open up our IDE. So I'm going to right click my Java folder and open it with Visual Studio Code. And let's make a new file. I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus sign, and we're going to call this conditions.java. Let's go ahead and make a class. I'm going to call this class conditions as well. And if you've ever written a main method before in Java, that's what we're going to need. So say it along with me, everybody. Public static void main parentheses string array args, and we have our main method. So let's look at the basic anatomy of a basic if statement. So if I put an if with two open parentheses and open and close curly brackets, and then between the parentheses I have a condition, that is the basic anatomy of an if statement. So let's hone in on what this condition is. What does condition have to be? Well, a condition inside of an if statement has to evaluate to true or false. And that is absolutely required. If it doesn't evaluate to either true or false, your if statement will not be successful. So I couldn't say something like if 7 and then check anything inside. That would not work. But I could say if 7 is greater than 10, that would work. So when I think of conditions, the first thing I think of is checking for equality. So let's see all the ways we can do that. We're going to go ahead and do some comments here. And just in case you don't know, 2 slashes represents a comment in Java. This is code that will not execute. So we could write whatever we would like. So I'm going to go ahead and put 2 slashes, and let's go through all of the possible equality checks that we could do. We can do 2 equal signs, and this represent equals. We can do an exclamation point and an equal sign, and this represent not equals. Because in Java and in most programming languages, an exclamation mark represent not. So keep that in mind because that's going to come up also a little later. We're going to do 2 more slashes. We can also do greater than. So this would be greater than. We can also do less than, which means that we have 2 more that we could probably do here, which is greater than or equal to. And then the final one, which would be less than or equal to. So those all check and those do a comparison. So if we wanted to actually do a comparison in our condition, we could say something like, does 4 equal 4? Now I know what you're thinking. Why don't I just do a single equal sign to represent checking equality? The reason why is because in Java and in most programming languages, a single equal sign, you're actually assigning a value. Think about when you're making a variable. So remember how we were talking about integers in the last variable video? If we said something like int grade and we said equals 50, that is assigning, remember the shoebox, we're assigning 50 to grade in that case. So the grade shoebox is getting 50 because the equal sign is telling it, hey grade, you're going to be 50. So when we see double equals, that's how we check for equality. So to break up the two, think 1 equal sign is assigning it, 2 equal signs is checking for equality. Now there's other languages where you could even get 3 equal signs. We're not going to talk about that in this video. But let's go ahead and continue. So what goes between this curly bracket after our condition? This right here is the true block. And now I know what you're saying. Well, what the heck is a true block? A true block is simply the block of code that executes when the condition is true. So that is how we can kind of guard our program against running something unless it meets a specific condition. So, for example, does 4 equal 4? Well, we all know that's true. So then something here, if I put a print, should print, right? Well, let's test it out. System.out.println, and let's go ahead and put 4 does equal 4. And then we'll put duh. Or at least we hope 4 equals 4. If it ever doesn't equal 4, I'm pretty sure a lot of things will break. But anyway, so let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. I'm going to open my terminal, and I'm going to go to my Java directory where I have this file. So I'm going to cd over, we're going to go to desktop and Java. And now let's compile the way we did it before. Java C, and then we're going to put the file name, so conditions.java. Remember, if there's no error, we shouldn't see anything, and we don't, so that's good. And now we can use Java to run our code. So Java, and let's do our class name. So we're going to do conditions, and we see 4 does equal 4, duh. So since we know 4 equals 4, well, what if it was does 4 equal 7? Let's check that. So we're just going to make that one change, and then we're going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and go Java C conditions.java, and then we see no error. Let's go ahead and run our class, and you can see nothing printed. So what exactly happened there? So basically what happened was the code came to this line right here, line 12, and it checked, hey, does 4 equal 7? Well, no, it doesn't. So since it doesn't, that means it was false. So that means basically what it did was it skipped over this line of code and came down here and said, okay, I'm going to continue after this curly bracket, and we'll go from there. So you can use an if to basically sandwich something between a condition that you only wanted to execute under a specific condition. Even though this one actually kind of brings the point home pretty well, let's actually show it in probably a little bit more of a real world scenario. Let's talk about grades just like we were in school. So we have a grade of 50 here, and we know that in school, at least in the American system, that if you get a 50 out of 100, you got an F. We're going to check our grade. We're going to say if grade is greater than 60, then we're going to say you passed the class. And then what else could happen? Well, if it's less than 60, we could also say then you failed the class. So how could we write that? We're going to do that with an else block. So let's go ahead and write else. And it's going to be an open and close curly bracket. And then in our else block, we can do system.out.println, and we can say you failed the class. So let's go ahead and say that you failed the class. It's not something that we like to say, but at least in this example, it makes sense. So let's go ahead and compile our code and see what happens. So if grade is greater than 60, it should say you passed, and if it's less, you failed. So this should say you failed the class. So let's run it. We're going to go back here. We're going to compile, and then we're going to do Java conditions to run. And you can see you failed the class. That's very unfortunate, but in this lesson, I'm pretty sure you're going to pass. At least I hope so. Now that we can see how an if and an else work, and if this is the true block, so then what would this be? This would be the false block right down here. So this executes when the condition is false. That's what it says. Basically, for all else, execute this code here. Now, what if we wanted to print a range of grades? Like, what if we wanted to state if someone got an A, B, C, D, or F? Well, if we wanted to do something like that, we could definitely do multiple if statements if we would like to try it. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we do multiple if statements. So I'm going to erase this else block here, and we're going to go ahead and copy this if block. So I'm just going to select this code, we're going to copy it, and let's make a couple of more if statements. So we got, let's see, 90, 80, 70, 60, and then 50. So let's go ahead and write those out. 90, 80, 70, 60, and then 50. Okay, so those are all the possible grades that we can see. And then below that would be like an F minus minus or something along those lines. But let's go ahead and actually do different print statements. We're going to say in this one, you got an A. In this one, you got a B. In this one, you got a C. I'm going to put gotta because I've been saying it like an Italian mobster. You got a C. Let's go ahead and do this one. You got a D, and then in this one we'll just put you failed. So we'll go ahead and erase this and put you failed because unfortunately there's no other way around it. So let's go through all our scenarios. We have if grade is greater than 90, 80, 70, 60, and 50. So we're checking for greater in every single instance. So what do you think is going to happen? Do you think, so grade up here is 50. So since grade is 50, are any of these going to print? Is one of them going to print? Or could potentially all of them print? Which one do you think is going to happen? Well, let's find out together. So let's save this and let's compile this code. No errors, so that's good. Let's go ahead and run the code. Nothing printed. Why? Well, let's go back and look. So int grade is set to 50. And in all the cases, 50 is less than 90. It's less than 80. It's less than 70. It's less than 60. And 50 is less than 50. How can we fix this one right here to make it print? We can change this from greater than to greater than or equal to. And that'll actually make it print. So if I run this again, let's see what happens. Compile and run. And we got you failed. So the reason why, again, just in case you didn't catch it. So is 50 greater than 50? What's the first integer greater than 50? 51. And that's why it didn't print. So in order for this to print the way it was, we would have had to put 51, and now it would have printed. So the other way we fix it again is we put 50 and we say greater than or equal to. What happens though now if we actually say you got a 91 or a 91? Yeah. So what's going to happen in this case? Is nothing going to print? Is one thing going to print 90, or is everything going to print? Which one do you think is going to happen? Like, as always, let's find out together. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to go ahead and do java c conditions.java. And then we're going to go java conditions. And look at that. Every single one of them printed. Now, let's figure out why. So if we go here, we have an if statement that says if grade is greater than 90. Is that true? Well, what does our comment say in here? This is the true block. So it's going to execute if the condition is true. So because it's executing if the condition is true, that doesn't stop it from executing for every other if statement. So it's possible that each if statement can print or do whatever it's trying to do if we don't protect it from having them all run. How can we stop that? The way we're going to stop that is with the concept of else if. So let's talk about that. How could we change this code to make it so that they only execute if one is successful and none other are successful? So let's change this code a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is, for every other if statement besides the first one, I'm going to put else in front of it. So we're going to say else if like this. And then we can do one last one down here. Now, is this going to run? And if it does, what's going to print? Do you think only 90 is going to print? Or do you think they'll all print again? Let's run it and see what happens. So let's compile. And then let's run. And look at that. Only you got an A printed. Why? What in Hello World's name stopped it from printing everything else? Because remember, this is a true block. True blocks execute, right? Well, with an else if, the way it works is like this. The first if statement in an else if chain to evaluate to true is going to execute, and any other statement inside of that chain will not execute, because that is how an else if works. It will block the execution of all the others by executing and then breaking out of the chain. So let's see an example by simply calling for 71. Let's change our value here to 71. So what's going to happen in this instance? Is 90, 80, 70, 60, or 50 going to print? Well, let's talk through it. Let's see. So we have 71. 71 is less than 90, so that's not going to work. 71 is less than 80, so that's not going to work. But 71 is greater than 70, so this should work. And this is also greater. 71 is greater than 60, so this should technically work. And then 71 finally is also greater than 50. We know that out of the possibilities, these are the three that could print. But let's see what the magic of an else if can do. So if we compile and then we run, you gotta see. And then, hey, look at this. You gotta see this. That's effectively how an else if works. Whichever if in that chain evaluates to true first, all the other ones will be barred from running even if they are true. So not only do you have if and if else, and then if else if, you have if, else if, and then else. So let's look at that one. The addition for here is just simply else. And then this is what I like to call the catch-all. Why? Is because basically in an if-else chain, there's multiple outcomes that can happen, or at least multiple outcomes that you can foresee. So in the final else, basically here, this is you throwing your hands up and saying, hey, if all else fails, then do this. And that's how I like to always look at the word else, is if all else fails, because that helps make sense of a lot of things that are happening above. So let's change this to 40. So by changing that to 40, and I just saved, let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Actually, let's put a print. So we're going to say you failed, and this one's going to be you failed really bad. So let's go ahead and copy this over, and then we'll just say really bad. And let's see what happens. So we're going to compile. And here's the moment of truth. Let's run it. You failed really bad. And let's take a look at why one more time. So you basically, if you look through this, you have grade is greater than 90. You got an A. So none of that's going to execute, because we already know that 40 is going to be less than all of these, including the final one here. Basically, this final catch-all will pretty much execute under any circumstances as long as all of the above fail. That's the important thing to remember. So if you put an else at the end of an if-else chain, this will always execute if all of the above fail. If you don't need an else statement at the end, like if you don't need a catch-all, make sure to just leave it off. You don't need to put one if you don't need it. Okay, so let's add 3 final concepts that I want to tack on here, which is going to be and, or, and not. So let's go ahead and put those all together. So let's erase every single one of these if-else chains because this one is going to be slightly different. So before we continue, let's add a little bit more terminology above to what we already have here. So let's take a look at, so those were the conditions. I'm just going to add a little bit of a separator. And then these ones are going to be and, not, and or. So let's do those together. This is what an and looks like. 2 and signs together, or ampersands. And this represents and. And or is represented by 2 pipes. So this is or. And then finally we have not, which if you remember from above, that's simply an exclamation mark, and that means not. Okay, so let's take a look at all 3 together. Let's start with not, because not is actually the easiest one to understand. Let's make a Boolean variable, and we're going to call this past the class. And we're going to go ahead and set this to true. So the cool thing that we did before is, so we're already a little bit familiar with this. We could say past the class equals true. There's something cool that we can do here too, since past the class is a Boolean variable and it will always evaluate to true or false because of that. Remember, a condition has to evaluate to true or false. Since it does, we can technically remove this and we're still going to check for true. So in this case, since this evaluates to true here, this should still print. Let's see. I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal. Oops, I have an error. What does my error say? It says, reach the end of line. I've got, it looks like an extra closing bracket somewhere. So for my main method, I deleted the curly bracket right here. So that's why it's important to pay attention to your error messages, just in case. So let's go ahead and run this back. So if I go to compile, this time I got no error. Let's go ahead and actually run our conditions method. And it says you got an A. So again, the reason why that happened is past the class is a Boolean variable. And because it always evaluates to true or false, it is considered a condition. And since the condition is true, this evaluates to true. Here's how we can change that. So what if we wanted only false to execute here? Well, what we could do is then say not in front of the variable. And this is actually going to change it to where if this is true in this condition, it is now false, because basically what we're saying here is not true. Take a look at that and you should understand after a couple attempts. So this is something that even I still mess up from time to time. But if you look, we're putting a not in front of a variable with the value of true. And whenever you have something not true, it must be false. So in this instance, the truth block actually turns into a false block. And now it has to be a false statement to execute. And let's check that. Let's go ahead and run our code. And you can see nothing printed. And the reason why is because nothing was after. We didn't have an else statement or anything like that after. And that's why nothing printed. So that's one way that you can change it with a not. Okay, so let's move on to and or. So the way I want you to think about and or is and or allow you to combine conditions. So what you could do here is something along the lines of this. Condition 1 and condition 2 and condition 3. And you can keep going down the line. You can and as many things as you want together. You can do an and chain as big as you want to do. But the key concept here to take away is understanding exactly how and works. So and basically is going to make sure both values evaluate to true. Otherwise, it's going to be false and go into the false block. What do I mean by that? So we know that pass the class is true. So let's check pass the class. And let's see if 4 equals 4. So we'll say 4 equals 4. So we know both of these are true. So this should evaluate to a system.out.print that actually prints you got an A. So let's go ahead and do a compile, save and compile. And you can see you got an A printed. Well, what if 4 didn't equal 4? What if we said, does 4 equal 7? Is this still going to print? What's your guess? Let's find out. Okay, so let's go ahead and compile. And let's go ahead and run our code. Nothing printed. Why? The reason why is because pass the class, this is true, but 4 does not equal 7. And because one thing is false, everything is false in that instance there. So there is definitely logic chains that you can put together that are very complicated, but just remember, whenever you're doing on a basic level an AND of 2 conditions, both need to be true in order for you to execute here. If both are not true, then nothing will execute inside of here. So let's change it one more time just to drive the point home. So we're going to say 4 equals 4, and then we'll also say 4 equals 7 here. So should this one print? What do you think? Let's run it. So save, and we're going to run, compile, sorry, and then we're going to run. And nothing printed. So that just drives the point home that both conditions need to be true whenever you're ANDing. But what about OR? Let's try OR. So OR is represented by 2 pipes. So we're going to go ahead and put 2 pipes. Now, how does an OR work? What's the key difference between AND and OR? So if AND needs both sides to be true in order to evaluate to true, the key difference for OR is OR has to have at least one true. So that means both can be true, one can be true, the other can be true, but both cannot be false. So let's test this out. So we can see here that this is 4, 4 does equal 4, and 4 does not equal 7. So only one of them is true here. So does this print? Let's save and test it out. Let's go ahead and go back. We're going to compile, and then we're going to run it, and it printed. So you got an A. So even though this one is the only true one, it's still printed. So let's change it up. Let's go ahead and do does 4 equal 4 on this side, and we'll say does 4 equal 3 on this side. So we'll save that, and let's run it again. So compile, and then we're going to run. It's still printed. So this time the other was true, and the other one was false, and it's still printed. What if both of them are true? So let's see. Is this going to print? Let's find out. So come into here. We're going to go ahead and compile. And then we're going to run it. Let's go ahead and go run. And it printed. Okay, so to summarize, let's go ahead and summarize up here real quick and just jot some notes down. So we'll do and first. We'll say and needs two trues to be true. And then if it's true false or false true or false false, these will all be false. So to summarize for or, let's actually do the false condition here. We'll say 4 equals 7 or 4 equals 9 and run this to see if this prints. But by now you should see that this is probably not going to print. So let's go ahead and compile and let's run it. And you can see it didn't print. So the conditions here for or is true true, true false, and false true will all evaluate to true, where false false will only evaluate to false. So look at the key difference between and or, and this summarizes it pretty well. And only evaluates to true when everything is true. Every other situation is going to evaluate to false. And then or is going to evaluate to true when there's at least one thing true. And then everything else that's false is just going to evaluate to false. So, and remember finally for not is going to take whatever you have and do the opposite. So if you have a true value, it's going to be false. So a lot of cool stuff. You can now see how complicated an if statement can be. And guess what? It can actually be more complicated. There's something called a ternary statement. We're not going to do that in this one though. I'll let you look that one up. But that's the basics of if statements. And actually that's pretty much everything for if statements. So I really hope you enjoyed the video. Other than that, I'm going to pass it to me in the future. Well, I guess that's it for if statements. I hope you learned something in this video. If not, I'm sorry for wasting your time. If you did, that's kind of cool. But anyway, I am DB. You were you. Let's keep kicking butt together and let's rock out. I just made myself so dizzy. That's it. Peace out, everybody.